He's born in Israel and grew up in Jerusalem as well as New York. He studied at the Hebrew University and Cambridge. He was a journalist at the Jerusalem Post for more than a decade and taught Middle East history at Ben Gurion University from 1997 to 2019. He's written many books, important books, that were published by Oxford University Press, Cambridge University Press, and Yale. And Benny was part of a group of historians that looked at the Palestinian refugee problem and was controversial back in the day for, I guess, an Israeli journalist looking at the issues in a critical manner. And now he's also at the, I guess, controversial in his work in looking at issues of anti-Semitism and jihad in the Palestinian and Muslim communities of the region. Politically incorrect, but a scholar who's always pursued the truth, regardless of the way it's received politically. So, a brave scholar, and we're honored that you're here.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
A pleasure.
Midway in the First Israeli-Arab War in August 1948, Emil Ruri, a member of the Arab Higher Committee, which was the cabinet of the Palestinian Arab National Movement, blamed the Arab states for creating the Palestinian refugee problem. He argued that the Arab states had pushed and cajoled the Arabs of Palestine into launching hostilities against the Jewish community in Palestine, then known as the Yishuv, in defiance of the United Nations partition resolution, while the Palestinians were disorganized and unprepared for war, and they themselves, the Arab states, launched their invasion of Israel in May 48, while disunited and insufficiently prepared. The war had resulted in the creation of the refugee problem. He rejected a solution of the problem by way of repatriation, arguing that the Jews would then hold them hostage and torture them severely. This is, he wrote in the Telegraph in London. Ruri assumed that a refugee return would be achieved through negotiations with Israel, and an agreement so achieved would mark the beginning of Arab acquiescence in Israel's existence. We must inculcate in the heart of every Arab, he said, hatred for the Jews, and we must renew the jihad against Israel. The refugees, he concluded, would return to their places only after Palestine was reconquered. Months earlier, in January 1948, just after the start of hostilities, Matiel Muranam, head of the Arab Women's Organization, which was the female arm of the Arab Higher Committee, told an interviewer, and this is January 1948, the United Nations partition decision has united all Arabs as they have never been united before, not even against the Crusaders. A Jewish state has no chance to survive now that the Holy War has been declared. All the Jews will eventually be massacred. Mrs. Muranam, it should be noted, was a Lebanese Christian who had married a Palestinian Arab and moved to Jerusalem in the 1930s. And she was saying that we're now engaged in a holy war. Following the pan-Arab invasion of Palestine in May 1948, the Saudi regime organized jihadi festivals around the kingdom in the towns and oases to mobilize volunteers for the war in Palestine. According to Madawi al-Rashid, an expert on Saudi Arabia in 1948, in 2 days, 2,000 men registered, and it was said that 200,000 were ready to perform jihad and sacrifice their lives. As it turned out, only several hundred were eventually dispatched from Saudi Arabia to Palestine. The Saudi religious authorities, the ulama, played a major part in the mobilization for jihad. The call for jihad also vibrated throughout the Maghreb, and thousands of Moroccans, Algerians, and Tunisians in the spring and summer of 48 set off to fight in the hills of Palestine, though only hundreds actually reached the battlefields due to French, British, and Egyptian interdiction along the way. Historians of 1948 have tended to view the First Arab-Israeli War as a milestone and turning point in a national struggle between two peoples or ethnic groups, the Jewish Zionist and Palestinian Arab collectives over a piece of territory called the Land of Israel or Palestine. A cult, through available documentation, essentially through Israeli and Western records, points to an additional and perhaps important aspect, and for some of the Arab participants in the war, a dominant aspect, namely the religious face of that war. In light of the available records, it would appear that many of the Arab participants in the 1948 war saw that onslaught against the Yishuv, Israel, as a holy war, a jihad against a foreign and infidel invader. An indication of this is provided in the transcript of an interrogation of a Syrian Arab Liberation Army soldier from Hama in Syria who was captured by the Jews near Yechiam in January 1948. According to the transcript of what he told them, the interrogators from the Haganah, it's as follows: Damascus radio broadcasts described the Jews, this is him talking basically, Damascus radio broadcasts described the Jews' attack on and humiliation of Palestine's Arabs. The radio broadcast awful stories about the killing of women and children, destruction and rape, and these shocked the Muslims of Hama. The cleric Said al-Jabi and the Hama governor incited the Muslims of Hama that they must volunteer for jihad to save Palestine's Arabs. In the end, a group of Hama notables went to the poor and the workers and influenced them to organize for jihad. And so 150 volunteers, and he was of course one of them, went off to train in a Syrian army camp. There, Fawzi al-Kaukji, who was the commander of the Arab Liberation Army, which was the Arab League's sort of volunteer army, which went to fight in the first months of the war on the side of the Palestinian Arabs against the Jews. Fawzi al-Kaukji came to give a talk, and this is what this volunteer from Syria recorded him as saying: "You are now going off to jihad to help the persecuted Arabs of Palestine. Our war is holy. We mustn't harm women and children and POWs. All the plunder, including women and children, belong to the military commander." This is what Fawzi al-Kaukji told the volunteers who are about to go off to fight in Palestine. It is possible that the opening of Arab state archives and a thorough troll through the press of the region stretching from Yemen to Iraq to Tangiers will only reinforce the impression that the political and military leaders of the Arab states and the street in Cairo and Baghdad and Sana'a and Marrakesh and the soldiers who actually fought in the war saw it as a holy war, and not only, or perhaps even not mainly, as a national war between two national movements. Now, this raises a methodological problem. The first and most obvious is that the archives of the Arab states, of the main Arab political parties, the royal courts, the armies, etc., of the Arab states, they're all closed to researchers. Jewish, Arab, foreign, they're all closed to everybody. All the states, the Arab states, are dictatorships of one sort or another, and dictatorships, of course, don't open their archives. This means that anyone interested in understanding the Arab side of the 48 war is forced in the main to view it through Western and Israeli documentation, often recording what was going on in the Arab states, etc., by diplomats and intelligence agents working in the Arab states, but nonetheless we're talking about Western and Israeli documentation, not Arab documentation, which is not accessible. The second problem is trying to work out what the bulk of Arabs, the masses, civilians and soldiers, actually thought in 1948. There were few, if any, opinion polls, and again we are talking about authoritarian states, not democracies, and states in which the vast majority of the populations were illiterate. For all intents and purposes, the masses do not speak in the documentation which exists. Occasionally a newspaper or leader will refer to what the street thinks, but that is all. We have no records, or almost no records, about what the masses thought or felt, certainly not from their own pens or mouths. The problem of lack of free expression also pertains to the more literate, numerically small, middle and upper classes. We don't really know what they thought or felt. And when an Arab leader describes the ongoing war in 48 in terms of jihad, does that prove that we are dealing with a jihad? or even a jihadi mindset? Is it possible that the term was used insincerely by this or that prime minister or king attentive to the presumed will of the street, or to appease religious and political radicals? We do not have protocols of Arab cabinet discussions, diaries of government ministers and kings, or the internal correspondence of the leaders. A third problem regarding whether we're talking really about a jihad is the problem of the culture of discourse that characterizes, and in some ways still characterizes, Arab governments and countries where there was and is no real separation between church and state. Often the rhetoric of politicians, the description or explanation of this or that policy or practice, will be couched in religious Islamic terminology, which doesn't necessarily mean that's what those leaders think, but they use that terminology because that's what's the discourse and what is expected of them. What we can say for now is that the historian must recognize that all his conclusions in this sphere must remain tentative until the Arab archives are closed, and it is possible if that apocalyptic event takes place, we will still remain largely in the dark about the question I am dealing with, partly because the question itself is one of mindset rather than concrete fact. And we are speaking of the mindsets of many millions of people rather than those of a coterie of politicians. All I can say for the present is that historians and students of the Arab world in '48 should treat seriously what the available records are telling us about what certain people in the Arab world thought and said, and not abruptly dismiss their utterances just because they do not match the contemporary historians' or students' historical and political views, preferences, or prejudices. And when 1948's Arab leaders, religious, military, and political, tell us something, we should pay attention to what they're saying. Perhaps they are giving voice to a major truth. The history of the Islamic world is studied by holy wars against infidel peoples and polities. The rise of Islam was characterized by an enormous, aggressive, jihadi wave in the 7th and 8th centuries, which saw the Arab conquerors sweep over the Middle East and North Africa as far as Spain and southern France. A second eruption of jihad, defensive in nature, occurred in the Middle Ages when Muslim warriors contained and then drove back the Crusaders and destroyed their kingdoms in the Levant. A third aggressive wave of jihad occurred in the early modern period when Turkic armies from the middle of the 15th century until the end of the 17th century assaulted the Balkans and Central Europe, reaching the gates of Budapest and Vienna. Today we are in the throes of the fourth wave of jihad, and there is a dispute in the West about whether to attribute it to Islam as a whole or just to radical Islamists. A wave directed against the West and its promontories around the world, stretching from the Philippines and Mumbai through East and West Africa, London and Madrid, and the Twin Towers in New York. At the center of this wave were the wars against infidels in Afghanistan, Iraq, and currently, of course, also in Palestine. One can view the current jihadi wave as aggressive or defensive. There are strong arguments for both positions. Be that as it may, it is possible that in several hundred years' time, the war between the Arabs and the Jews in 1948 will be seen as the beginning, or at least as a major milestone in this wave that confronts the West in our time. The Arab word jihad means to make an effort, and in its religious connotation has been defined as a bloodless striving in missionary zeal for the spread of Islam, meaning, if you like, an effort at it's a difficult word. Proselytize. Okay, we'll shorten it. There are analysts who focus on the meaning of the word jihad and denude it of all political and military meaning. And there are commentators who argue that the Islamic doctrine of jihad is essentially a defensive doctrine. The believers embark on jihad only in defense when assailed by infidels. But a more honest and discerning look at the deeds of Muhammad and his successors, and at the mainstream exegeses of Islamic scholars during the following centuries, leave little room for doubt or evasion about the meaning of the word jihad and the doctrine of jihad. In the Quran, the believers are enjoined to fight the holy war against the infidels. Fight those who do not believe in Allah or in Judgment Day and who do not accept the true religion, even if they be the peoples of the book, meaning Jews and Christians mainly, until they pay the jizya, the poll tax, in submission and feel themselves submissive. That's the Quran. In most of the exegetic texts, there is an obligation before doing battle to call on the infidels to convert to Islam, or at least to submit to Muslim rule. And only if the infidels reject the call are the believers bound to open hostilities. But the Muslims, individually and as a collective, are obliged to wage jihad against the infidel. As it says in the Quran, battle is your duty, even if you do not like it. Now, it is true that the Quran is often vague and obtuse, and one can find in its sentences sending the reader and believer in a variety of directions. But among the major Muslim theologians in the millennium following Muhammad's death, a more or less consensual mainstream emerged about the main pillars of the religion. This holds true also for the doctrine of jihad. Ibn Khaldun, a great Sunni philosopher and historian of the 14th century, put it this way: in the Muslim community, jihad is a religious obligation because of the universality of the Muslim mission and the duty to Islamize all mankind, or through persuasion or through force. Other religious groups did not have a universal mission, and holy war was not a religious duty to them, save in self-defense. But Islam, on the contrary, is bound to rule over other peoples. In Shia Islam, jihad is seen in the same way. Islamic jihad, this is a quote, against the believers in other religions, for example, the Jews, is an obligation save if they convert to Islam or pay the poll tax in advance. As Al-Amili, a prominent Persian theologian of the 16th and 17th centuries, put it. The belief that jihad, in order to forcibly convert or at least vanquish the rest of humanity, is obligatory for the believers, and it's based on the sentence, "We have sent you out to all mankind," as the Quran says. And definitive world peace is only attainable if the whole world accepts or bows to Islam. In the course of the struggle, truces, even long-term ceasefires, are possible, but the fight against the infidels must be maintained until they are defeated. In Western eyes, this posture is seen as aggressive or unjust, but in the eyes of classical Islam, it appears self-evident and just, as the truth is found only in Islam, and the award of the truth to others, also by way of the sword, is sensible and just. It is possible that Muhammad's war against the Jewish and pagan tribes in Hijaz at the dawn of Islam are interpretable by the believers as defensive, the view being that without victory Islam would be vanquished and they themselves would be put to the sword. But Muhammad's successors from the caliphs onwards initiated wars of expansion and conquest against the Christian world with the aim of converting the whole of humanity to Islam. And this holds true for Christians and Jews as well as pagans. According to all Quranic texts, the aim of jihad against the peoples of the book is to convert them to Islam or obtain their submission to Islam, and participation in jihad is the duty of all adult Muslim males unencumbered by physical or mental handicap. The believers were ordered not to kill children, madmen, women, priests, impotent old men, the sick, the blind, the mentally infirm, so long as they do not take part in the battle, as one 13th century exegetist put it. According to Ibn Taymiyyah, a major 13th and 14th century theologian, the obligation to participate in jihad appears innumerable times in the Quran and the Sunnah. Therefore, that is the most important willed religious activity a man can undertake. All the sages agree that it is important that the Hajj, the Prophet said the supreme issue is Islam. All the sages agree that it is more important than the Hajj. The Prophet said the supreme issue is Islam and its peak is the jihad. Jihad is obligatory both if we began it and if undertaken in defense, according to Ibn Taymiyyah. Indeed, one 12th century exegetist Al-Razali wrote that one should undertake jihad at least once a year, which sounds a bit tiring, but that's what he wrote. In the days after the UN General Assembly passed the partition resolution waves of rioters hit the streets of the large towns in the Arab world and attacked Jews and Europeans and their property. At the beginning of December 1947, there were pogroms in Aden, Bahrain, and Aleppo in Syria, and a variety of assaults on Jews in Cairo and Damascus. The rioters commonly shouted, "Kill the Jews," Idbach al-Yahud, and in most cases the authorities failed to rein them in, certainly not expeditiously. Dozens of Jews were murdered and hundreds of houses were torched in the Muslim world. On the 2nd of December, and I think this is the key expostulation of jihad in the course of the war. On the 2nd of December 1947, 3 days after the UN vote, the ulama, the scholars of theology of the University of Al-Azhar in Cairo, perhaps the most important arbiters and authorities in the Sunni Muslim world, declared a worldwide jihad in defense of Arab Palestine. This was a fatwa. Yeah? In the course of the war, the ulama of Al-Azhar periodically renewed the fatwa and called to jihad. The liberation of Palestine is a religious duty for all Muslims without exception, great and small. The Islamic and Arab governments should without delay take effective and radical measures, military or otherwise, pronounced the ulama at the end of April 1948. In other words, in advance of the pan-Arab invasion of Palestine, if you like, to egg it on, to make it actually happen. On the day of the Egyptian army invasion of Palestine, 15 May, Muhammad Mamoun Shinawi, the rector of Al-Azhar, the Sheikh of Al-Azhar, declared, "The hour of jihad is struck. 100 of you will defeat 1,000 of the infidels. This is the hour in which Allah promised paradise." And in December 1948, on the eve of the final bout of hostilities between the IDF, the Israeli army, and the Egyptians in the Negev and Sinai, the ulama of Al-Azhar renewed their call for jihad and cautioned the Arab kings. This was really primarily directed at Abdullah, king of Jordan, who was suspected of colluding with the Jews, against deviating, this is what the Al-Azhar's new fatwa said, against deviating from the way of the believers. Otherwise they face damnation. The jihadism of 1948 was accompanied by a strong dose of anti-Semitism. In 1947, well before the outbreak of the war, the ulama of Al-Azhar issued a fatwa prohibiting all commercial contact with the Jews and defined anyone doing so as a sinner and a criminal who will be regarded as an apostate to Islam. Samir Rifai, the Prime Minister of Transjordan, which became Jordan, told visitors in Amman in 1947 that the Jews are a people to be feared. Give them another 25 years and they will be all over the Middle East, in our country, in Syria and Lebanon, in Iraq and Egypt. They were responsible for starting the 2 world wars. Yes, I have read and studied, and I know they were behind Hitler at the beginning of his movement. Now, this is the Prime Minister of Jordan, and Jordan was led by the most moderate, of course, of the Arab leaders in 1948, King Abdullah. Rifai's observations reflected beliefs that spread through the Middle East at the end of the 19th century and the early 20th century, which added a modern stratum to the classic anti-Semitic utterances embedded in the Quran, where the Jews are designated inter alia as a base people and as murderers of the prophets. There is religious hostility between the Muslims and the Jews from the beginning of Islam, which arose from the treacherous conduct of the Jews towards Islam and Muslims and their prophet. King Ibn Saud of Saudi Arabia explained to President Roosevelt in 1943. The Muslim Brotherhood defined it thus: Jews are the historic enemies of Muslims and carry the greatest hatred for the nation of Muhammad. In April 1948, Sheikh Muhammad Makhawif, the Mufti of Egypt, issued a fatwa calling on all Muslims to participate in the jihad in Palestine. His contention was that the Jews intend to take over all the lands of Islam. It is no wonder then that during the 1930s and 1940s, the following hadith in different variants was quoted in Islamic tracts. This day of resurrection does not come until Muslims fight against Jews, until the Jews hide behind trees and stones, and until the trees and stones shout out, "O Muslim, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him." Side by side with the traditional anti-Semitic message, the 1948 call to jihad had another historical pedigree. Before and during 1948, the Zionists were often compared by Arab spokesmen to the Crusaders, and we've seen this. And almost always it was said that their end would be similar to that of the Crusaders. As the Secretary General of the Arab League, Abdul Rahman Azam Pasha, put it in 1947, "You, the Jews, are a temporary phenomenon. Centuries ago, the Crusaders established themselves in our midst against our will, and in 200 years we ejected them." Shukri al-Kawatli, the president of Syria in 1948, said similar things in 1948 on the eve of the pan-Arab invasion. He said, "Overcoming the Crusaders took a long time, but the result was victory. There is no doubt that history is repeating itself." Riyad al-Sulh, the prime minister of Lebanon, told a British diplomat in the course of the war that it had taken the Arabs over a century to expel the Crusaders, but they had succeeded in the end. Zafar Dajani, the head of the Jaffa Chamber of Commerce, said similar things to a Jewish interlocutor in 1947. The Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood announced that the death of martyrs in Palestine conjured up the early Islamic jihad for spreading Islam and Salah ad-Din's liberation of Palestine from the Crusaders. Salah ad-Din being, of course, Saladin, the man who essentially defeated the Crusaders. Perhaps it is worth noting that the first Arab publicly to make the comparison was Shukri al-Asali, a comparison between the Zionists and Zionism and the Crusaders. It was a man called Shukri al-Asali, the Ottoman governor of Nazareth during the 1910-1911 struggle over the lands of Fula, an Arab village in the Jezreel Valley built around the ruins of a Crusader castle. The land had been bought by Zionist institutions, and shortly after, Kibbutz Merchavia was established on the site of this former Arab village of Fula, which was the site of a Crusader castle. Since then, Arab spokesmen have often referred to Zionists as the new Crusaders. In 1945, Azam Pasha argued that the clash between the Arabs and Zionism might trigger a new war between the Christian and Muslim worlds, as did the Crusades. The banner of jihad was raised aloft, or at least mentioned with regard to the Yishuv, already during the decades before 1948. In March 1936, the Speaker of the Iraqi Parliament, Said al-Hajj Tabit, while on a visit to Palestine, called for jihad against the Zionists. A decade earlier, Hajj Muhammad Said al-Husseini, the Mufti of Gaza, issued a fatwa against land sales to Jews, arguing that as a result of Zionism, the Jews had lost their status as zimmi, or wards of Islam, and any Muslim or Christian who helped them would be regarded as an apostate or infidel. In 1935, the first ulama, or gathering of Muslim religious scholars in Palestine, issued a similar fatwa, 1935. So all of this sort of precedes in 1948. During the Palestine Arab revolt of 1936-39, the discourse among the rebels, to judge by their publications, was often religious as well as political nationalist, and the struggle was seen as, at least in part, as religious. Indeed, the 1936 announcement of the establishment of the Arab Higher Committee, the leadership body of the national movement that in effect orchestrated the revolt, included the following typical sentence: "Because of the general feeling of danger that envelops this noble nation, Palestine's Arabs, there is a need for solidarity and unity and a focus on strengthening the holy national jihad movement." Preachers in the Nablus area were prominent among those mobilizing the population for combat. Therefore, it is no surprise that when the Arab peoples launched their assault on the Yishuv in 1948, the campaign was regarded by many as a jihad and was reinforced with fatwas by the religious leaders embracing holy war. And it was to be expected that the Arab leaders would fall into step. Both King Farouk of Egypt and his foreign minister, Khashaba, said during the summer of 1948 that for the whole Arab world the struggle was a matter of religion. It was for them a matter of Jewish religion against their own religion. This is a quote, Farouk quoted by diplomats who met him in the summer of 48. According to Farouk, the Arab masses were gripped by widespread religious fervor, and men were keen to enter the fray as the shortest road to heaven. This is what he told diplomats, perhaps explaining why he was sort of sucked into a war in Palestine, which he wasn't, of course, very successful in, and maybe even was very reluctant to enter. Even Abdallah, king of Jordan, and as I said, the most clear-headed and pragmatic of the Arab leaders, adopted the language of holy war when on 14th of May he addressed his troops about to cross the Jordan River into Palestine. He said, "He who will be killed will be a martyr. He who lives will be glad of fighting for Palestine. I remind you of the jihad and of the martyrdom of your great-grandfathers." The defeat of the Arab armies failed to reduce the fervor of their spiritual guides. In December 48, the ulama of Al-Azhar, as I said, renewed their call for jihad, addressing the Arab kings and presidents and opinion makers. They reiterated the need to free Palestine from the Jewish gangs, proclaiming that the Arab armies had fought victoriously in the conviction that they were fulfilling a sacred religious duty, as they phrased it. And those who failed to undertake jihad would be damned. They reissued this fatwa, the ulama of Al-Azhar, for jihad in December 48, after essentially the Arab armies had lost the war, with obviously a clear look forward to further bouts of warfare against the Jews. In other words, they didn't, of course, admit defeat, but they were saying, we have been defeated in this round, we will fight on afterwards as jihad. This is what Muslims must do. Let me conclude by saying that all I am doing here is suggesting a lead. I have not thoroughly and fully studied and searched the records. As I say, the records of the Arab states are closed. One can look at newspapers around the Arab Muslim world from 48, which I haven't done. That still remains to be done. And I have a feeling that a trawl through whatever does exist and is available and accessible will sustain what I've just described.
Comments and questions, please refer to me. Harris?
Thank you, Charles. First of all, Benny, thank you for coming here and teaching me as a Muslim how I should be a Muslim. I'd like to thank you for that. And I'd like to say to everybody here on the record, as Managing Director of ISGAP, this is my jihad, and I'm here to forcibly convert you by the sword or to persuade you to join me. I'm putting you on notice, and this is my once-a-year ISGAP Summer Institute visit. I will give you the alternative version, I'm going to change my presentation, the alternative version of the Islam that I follow, and the overwhelming majority of Muslims follow around the world. I will deconstruct now Ibn Taymiyyah, who was quoted, who is the theological grounding for ISIS. So basically what you've heard is the Muslim Brotherhood, ISIS, Al-Qaeda version of Islam, which we ordinary Muslims have been fighting, certainly at me since 9/11 and 7/7, and people have been killing me. Muslims have been killing people like me for these beliefs. We are the first target. I would like to ask you, Benny, as a Muslim, a theologian, I have ijazas in Shafi and Hanafi fiqh, I have ijazas in Tasawwuf, I have ijazas in Imam Ghazali. When he said jihad once a day, what he was talking about is out of context. He was talking about tazkiyat al-nafs, the purification of the self, and jihad al-akbar, the greatest jihad, which is to do good rather than evil and fight yourself. But Benny, I'm a Muslim, I do have theological background, ijazas I have, from people who, as sheikhs, if you combine all of Al-Azhar's current leadership, one of them, Sheikh Hisham Kabani, has more followers, Sheikh Nazim Kiprusi, Sheikh Habib Ali Jifri, many others, Nahdlatul Ulama in Indonesia. But tell me, as a believer, I fast, I do all the things, what should I do when it comes to jihad? By the sources that you've read.
By the sources I've read, I think you should go out and fight. You shouldn't waste your time here.
Thank you. You're all on notice. I'll see you all outside afterwards before dinner. Thank you.
The captain of the road sells swords.
Oh, perfect. Perfect. Please bring your own. I don't have enough to pass around.
Do you have some more?
Do it.
Not yet. I can make one.
Can I say, actually, it's not really a joking matter. Jihad, I understand what you're saying about jihad, the purification of the soul, etc. All of this is in the texts as well. But the current meaning of the word jihad in the Muslim Arab world, I fear, is more of the sort I quoted from, and is to do with fighting the infidels.
So all the UAE should fight Israel.
I'm not saying that there aren't exceptions. I'm just saying that in most of the Arab world, after the Twin Towers...
I agree a lot.
A lot,
So
okay.
I concede that.
Okay, after the Twin Towers fell, Bin Laden shirts with Bin Laden's portrait, were selling like hotcakes on the streets of Cairo. It's not just a matter of...
And I have worked with the guy who actually was in the cave, joining and planning 9/11, who has now disavowed the theology, ideology, and rehabilitated people.
Hang on. Let Benny respond to the comments, and then we'll take more questions.
Yeah, there are, as you say, there's moderate Muslims, there are extremist Muslims. Essentially, I wasn't talking about, I'm not talking about Islam today and the struggle within Islam, which does exist. And as you say, some people are putting their lives on the line in combating extremist Islam. But essentially, I was talking about 48, and basically all I was saying was, in 48, Islam played a major role in the pan-Arab assault on the Zionist entity, both among Palestinians and by the Arab armies, the armies of the Arab states. This is what I'm arguing, which is not a common belief, not the conventional belief among most historians of the 48 war. They've usually brushed aside or brushed under the carpet the argument that there was a general Islamic thrust to the war, and they say it was a national war, like between, I don't know, I'm just trying to think of a war where there is no religious element, but between Germany and France in 1914 or 1940, it was a political nationalist struggle between two groups over a piece of land. That's how most historians of 48 have portrayed the war. What I'm saying is that my reading of the documents forced me essentially to say that there was also, there was also an important religious element in the war. And let me add one more thing. That religious element was on the Muslim Arab side. It wasn't on the Jewish side. Today, it exists in the Jewish side, a strong religious element based on the settler movements, the religious parties who have introduced religion into the conflict as a major element driving their beliefs and struggles in this conflict with the Arabs. But in 48, the religious parties in Israel, the religious population was extremely small, had almost no political importance or a power. And this was not what led people like Ben Gurion and Sharet and Yadin and all the rest of the people who led the country in that war. Religion was unimportant to them. They may have understood that on the Arab side, that is an important element in the battle, but on the Jewish side, it played no part at all in 48.
Just want to comment on what you said and what Professor Morris said. I have to recall who, and I paraphrase, the person who said that for evil to thrive and exist, it takes that good people do nothing about it.
Martin Luther King.
That's right. So I don't believe all Muslims believe in the jihad that Professor Morris said. I don't believe that all Christians or the whole world are anti-Semite. I don't believe that the majority of the world is evil. The problem is the minority are loud, are determined, and they make so much noise that the majority believes that the majority of the world like this, and then it ends up that the good people, the majority of the people that are good, do nothing about it. And that's the problem.
The bad people also have to do something, though.
They are doing plenty bad. Yes.
Diane?
I agree with that, and I think also though the danger lies in what we're here for, the anti-Semitism that we see in academic circles, because even though that is true, it's a loud minority, that loud minority is indoctrinating and proselytizing the youth. And so they're getting all of this ideology in their classrooms. You know, they come in wide-eyed, starry-eyed freshmen with all these hopes and dreams and hearts full of compassion, and they absorb all of this information from these, you know, superstar intellectual educators, and they come out 4 years later, or if it's a graduate degree 2 years later, or whatever, PhD 5 years later, thinking like the minority, or much closer to the minority's ideology on the spectrum than they are to moderate center, or, you know, slightly past that. As that's where the danger is that loud minority is making progress.
And I'll make a comment before there's another question. I don't think Iris and Benny are necessarily in disagreement.
But we are on one thing with
If
Benny
I can
said.
just finish, please.
Sorry.
I'll make my comment, then you can disagree with me,
Okay.
if that's okay. In the sense, I don't think that Benny was necessarily acting as a scholar of Islam, but he was saying, historically, Muslims were using Islamic text and hadith and interpretations to engage in a war against the Jewish people and the state of Israel. And the ideology that Benny's referring to, in my humble opinion, when it comes to the study of anti-Semitism, you know, the Muslim Brotherhood speaking on behalf of Muslims all over the world, these reactionary social movements, the Brotherhood that was expressed, and I think Benny is correct in perceiving the war in 1948 as a jihad, and the sort of reactionary social movement using, in the name of Islam, fusing European anti-Semitism with Islam, laying the foundation, the ideological and military and policy movement of the Brotherhood, which leads to Hamas and Hezbollah and the Iranian Revolutionary Regime and Daesh and other Islamist or radical extreme variations of Islam that uses anti-Semitism, and played a crucial role in the almost complete rejection of Jewish self-determination in the region. And anti-Semitism, as you know, and I think the survey, and Harris, I know you know, if we still, even though there's peace emerging in the Abrahamic Accords, if we do some of the surveys that have come out in looking at anti-Semitism in the region, is staggering. You know, over 90% of Egyptians, and the level of anti-Semitism, because of this, in part, interpretation of Islam or the portrayal of Islam as having certain types of views of the Jews and of Israel and the Zionists and the obligations that the social movement places on Muslims to engage Jewish self-determination has been very damaging. And you're right. And people, I'd say people with anti-Muslim sentiment often portray Islam and Muslims in a certain way. And I think, as Harry was saying yesterday, this perception of Islam in the diaspora also leads to kind of nationalism and xenophobia in other parts of the world. So I'm not so sure that we are disagreeing.
I'm in disagreement with, I agree about 1948, I concede that's absolutely right. Where I have an intellectual, emotional, ideological and spiritual issue is, and I asked you the question for a reason, what should I, under your reading, do as a Muslim? And you said I should fight. And this is what the far right, what Al-Qaeda, what ISIS, what the Muslim Brotherhood, what some of the Al-Azhar imams, as Rami knows, this is what they teach. And I think that it can be dangerous as academics, if you're going out to build your curriculums, to actually think that that really is what Islam says, obligates. Not what people in Islam say. That's a different matter. So I think it can be dangerous to just hear that side. But it should be heard, absolutely, but it should hear the other side as well. Otherwise, what's the point in the Indonesians, me many other people,
That's a-
and that's the only point I was making.
It's a very important point, and it should be noted very seriously. I concur. So Deidre.
So as a professor of religious studies, I appreciate that you're adding that extra context for jihad, because when I teach about it to my students, I remind them that it's not just going to war, it's healing the sick, it's educating it. Jihad means the struggle, right? But what I appreciate about what you're doing here, and I'm not sure everyone appreciates just how in opposition you are to a narrative about 48, in terms of saying that this is a religious question, that talking about jihad, it's not just politics and nationalism, it's also religion. So religious studies professor, very happy. But what I really would like to hear more from you is if you recognize or you have reflected on how important this is to our discussions of anti-Semitism. Because one of the ways that our experiences as Jews of anti-Semitism in the contemporary context is erased is by saying it's not about religion, saying that it's just politics. And by reminding us of the ways that religion and religious ideas motivate much of these and empower these narratives, it's a different argument, it's a different strategy. So that's why, I hear like your passion saying, yes, we have to acknowledge this is the jihadi thinking. It's because it makes a difference in who we're talking to and how they're going to respond to our claims on articulating our lived experience of when you bash Israel, it's religion too. It's not just politics, as if that makes it more innocent.
Okay, thank you for your comment. Harry.
Just a comment and a question, really. My comment is that, though I entirely agree with you, Harris, that the people who go out to murder, assault, are in a complete minority, they are acting. They are not acting alone. They are a product of what I'm speaking about anti-Semitism here when it comes to attacks on synagogues and Jewish property by Islamists. They are acting as a result of what Mehdi Hassan described in his article for New Statesman, this normalised culture of anti-Semitism within parts of our Muslim communities. And so, whilst I think absolutely we must recognise they're a minority, we should also acknowledge that they are a product of a wider issue which affects large parts of Muslim communities. And FRA polls from the European Union when it comes to European anti-Semitism demonstrate that actually most Jews are disturbed by Islamist anti-Semitism more than they are any other form of anti-Semitism. And I think that needs to acknowledge, and your colleague also, former colleague rather, Majid Nawaz, said when I think on an interview with back in the day when he was working for LBC, which is a radio station here in the UK, not my favourite anymore, but he said that Islamism is a plausible reading of Islam, and I think that needs to be acknowledged. So whilst it isn't the interpretation of Islam, it is a plausible interpretation of Islam, and I think that distinction is critical. My question, though, to you, and perhaps Harry could also contribute to this as well, is that a lot of what we see, and this is a point Batya Orr made in her work and her scholarship, that actually a lot of what motivates Palestinian activity or anti-Israelism is this desire to return to a state of divitude, if you will, that is, the Jew submits to Islamic rule, is under Islamic rule. And I just wonder, to what extent do you think that idea influences the Palestinian movement today and wider jihadist movements?
Again, this is a problem of working out who's in the minority and who's the majority, what majority thinking is and what minority thinking is. But let me comment on that, and maybe it does respond in some way to your question. The thing which gets Palestinians in Israel and the territories on the streets, rioting, killing if they can, is the supposed threat, as they see it, to the Muslim shrines in Jerusalem. In other words, if they say come out into the street and demonstrate for a Palestinian state. We need statehood now like every normal nation has, etc. Nobody will go out into the street. Nobody. Somebody will, but nobody will go out into the street. If you say the Jews are about to take the Temple Mount and burn down the mosques and set up a third temple on the Temple Mount, they'll come out into the streets in millions and riot and even kill if they can. So religion still plays an enormous role in the Palestinian national movement. When they want to mobilize, when Haj Amin al-Husseini wants to mobilize his people, he shouts, as in 1929, they're after the mosques, they're going for the mosques. And the same is done exactly today by the Hamas, by the Islamic Jihad, and even by people in the Fatah. It's not just the supposed Islamists, but it's also the mainstream Fatah, which is supposed to be a secular movement. When they sent out their suicide bombers to compete with the suicide bombers of the Hamas and the Islamic Jihad during the Second Intifada, they told them 70 virgins await you and all the rest of the spiel about how it's good to be a martyr. So unfortunately or fortunately, religion plays a major role in the minds and mindsets of those struggling against Israel. One last thing, I think in talking about the Muslims in the world, one should, I think, differentiate between Muslims in the West, in Britain and maybe in France as well, certainly in Anglo-Saxon countries, and those in the centers of Islamic demography, you know, Cairo and Baghdad and Damascus, etc. I'm not sure that the relative weights of moderates and extremists is the same. I don't think it's the same in Britain as it is in Cairo. That's my sense. But I may be wrong about that. You're saying it's not like that. I'm not sure you're right. You're probably right about Britain, Muslim communities in Britain and the West. I'm not sure it's true about Muslim communities in the heartlands of Islam.
The largest Muslim organization in the world is an organization called Nahdlatul Ulama, and they're from Indonesia. And they have more than 100 million paid members. They're Sufi. They think exactly the same thing I do. I know the head. However, Benny's absolutely right that religion is used as a form of redemption, protection to get people out, not just in Israel, in Jerusalem, but around here as well. I gave a lecture in 2009 when I first met Charles, and I posed the question: is anti-Semitism becoming the default position amongst Muslims under the age of 40 in the West? Well, you don't have to just be an Islamist to be anti-Semitic anymore. I followed up on that lecture in Jerusalem last year. The lines are blurred when it comes to anti-Semitism now. It's not, 10 years ago it was different. The guys who were shouting in the cars, rape the Jewish daughters, they're not Islamists. They were from Bradford, they were from the Barelwi Sufi traditions, and they haven't been told that they have to do that because of their religion. They've been told because they have to defend a Waqf, a part of Jerusalem, which is Temple Mount, Beit al-Maqdis. It's actually not even Al-Aqsa, it's Beit al-Maqdis, the gold dome. And they are reacting from an emotionally, from a religious argument, you're right, to protect, and they're not Islamists. So when we talk about Islamists and fundamentalists, the lines are a bit blurred. And I will actually talk about this a little bit more. I don't want to take away from Benny's time. But Benny's right about how they're getting people out.
Thank you. One comment and one question. The comment is that I wish you would talk more about Amin al-Husseini, who I think was the first one, or one of the first people who brought this narrative into the conflict, instead of being a territorial conflict or a national conflict, with the comments about the mosque and the meetings with Nazis and bringing all this propaganda. I think that he's the one to blame to bring this narrative into the conflict. But the question is this one. What do you think is changing or has shifted in the world so we can today have the Abraham Accords? Because something positive must have happened. I mean, I'm not sure if in Cairo and you know, this countries that are in next proximity to Israel, but definitely something has shifted, and I know the political stuff, and I know, but something within the people has shifted, so we can have today this Abraham Accords.
And could it have happened before?
Huh?
What could it have happened before? Just adding to your question, which is a fantastic question.
Well, as to the Abraham Accords, those are agreements between states, between the leaderships of states, the Jewish state and the United Arab Emirates, apparently Morocco, Bahrain, and so on. I don't know to what extent they reflect public opinion in those countries, though they may actually reflect it. They may reflect it, I don't know, or majority opinion. I think the Abraham Accords is a product of the threat of Iran and Shiite Iran vis-a-vis the Sunni or so-called moderate Sunni Arab world. I think that's what lies at base. But I think we should also recall and give credit to Sadat, the president of Egypt, who actually broke Arab ranks and made peace with Israel. He was actually the man who led the way. He was the vanguard. And my reading, and he was a very religious man, incidentally, my reading of Sadat and what motivated him to reach basically peace with Israel was that he understood that for Egypt and the Arab world, continued conflict would in the end lead to total destruction. It would lead to an atomic war, and Egypt would not be able to sustain this. And he worked, I think, for the benefit of his people, and said this doesn't make any sense to just continue this war, and it's going to end in our destruction. The Abraham Accords is a continuation of this, with the addition, if you like, of the Iranian threat, which I think motivates the leaderships in the Sunni Gulf states. I think that's very important. It could be that there's also something deeper, that the Arab peoples are also slowly, as they've given up the vision of reconquering Spain, Andalus, maybe they're also gradually coming to accept in some way the Jewish state's existence. Time will tell if that's really a sort of a deep thing, or just the leadership feeling this for the reasons I mentioned. Haj Amin al-Husseini certainly knew how to mobilize. Firstly, he was a cleric, and he was unusually, incidentally, in the 20th century, a cleric leading a nationalist movement. The only other one I can think of or know about is Makarios in Cyprus, who was a cleric who led a nationalist rebellion and movement. But it's unusual for a cleric to lead a political movement, a nationalist movement, and he was the man who did it. And he understood that in order to mobilize the masses to do that, as I mentioned, you have to speak about the threat to the holy of holies of at least Palestinian Islam, which is the Temple Mount and the Haram al-Sharif and the mosques on the mount. The man was deeply anti-Semitic, and you see that in his writings, in his preachings. During the war, he worked for the Nazi broadcasting service and preached to the Middle East, basically calling for the peoples, the Arabs in the Middle East, to murder the Jews wherever they could. This is one of his famous broadcasts. He was deeply anti-Semitic, and he also, in his memoirs, he produced memoirs which also show that he believed in these things, which Rifai mentioned, the Prime Minister of Jordan, which I quoted, about the Jews being responsible for this and being responsible for that. And so anti-Semitism certainly motivated him, in addition to this sense that Islam was in a mortal struggle with the Jews in Palestine. I could talk more about Haj Amin, but interesting character. Also, Hitler remarked about Hitler liked his blue eyes. The man had blue eyes, and Hitler sort of said, as an aside, the man has obvious Aryan roots.
Thanks very much for quite an enlightening lecture. I guess from a research perspective, I'm quite curious of how you make the connection between the religious aspect of the motivation for anti-Semitism and indeed a certain given kind of religion in general, and this time in relation, of course, Islamism. And my question is really informed by this kind of reading of Amartya Sen's idea that we are many different things and we are shaped by many different things, and we can't pin down an individual to one given single identity. That's the theory he makes in his Identity and Violence, the Illusion of Destiny. I'm asking that because, I mean, I'm supposed to be Christian, I guess. I think I am. But I didn't choose that. And when I look at the history of Christianity in Africa, in much of the colonial world, it was a very violent process. I mean, I talked to my grandfathers how they were forced to eat, for example, taboo foods in order to not be able to go back to the old days. So, like, for example, eating chicken was a taboo, and then the missionaries would make them eat chicken in order not to be any more accepted within their communities, and then they would be obliged to convert. That was the benign form. There are many other more violent kind of forms of what we know in North America, for example, Canada now, the debate they have about the residential school kind of things. Now, also when I read the Bible and I studied in a Catholic seminary, there is a lot of violence in the Bible. I mean, there is a slaughter them, children, and don't leave women and children kind of things. And then we see interpretations of this in North America, for example, with the Jews will not do, I mean, you guys know better than I do. Now, keeping all of that in mind, can you also say that Christianity is a violent religion, or there are violent interpretations of the religion? And here then my question is really pretty much joining the question which was asked here. And I know we are talking about one jihad, but what comparison can also be made with Christianity? Thanks.
Well, you're asking me to talk about very big things, and I like to talk about smaller things. But look, Christianity went through violent stages as well. Currently, Christianity is not crusading, essentially, even though George Bush used that word crusade when he went to invade Iraq or whatever. But essentially, it's not a crusading religion, Christianity, and it preaches, its mainstream certainly preach peace and whatever, and goodwill to peoples and to other faiths. But it did pass through very violent stages. The people who murdered Jews when they conquered Jerusalem in 1099 or whatever, they were Christians, and they were doing this on the way to Palestine and in Palestine in the name of religion. But Christianity has changed over the hundreds of years since the Crusades and since the wars of the Reformation. Christianity has changed, and one can't speak of Christianity as a violent religion, even though you will find Islamic preachers who do think and talk about Christianity as being a violent religion against which they are defending. That is, they're defending themselves against Christianity, and that the invasions of Iraq or the attacks on Afghanistan or whatever are eruptions of Christianity. That's the way they will describe them when they're trying to persuade their people to fight the Americans or whatever in these areas. Certainly Christianity, Christians, not Christianity, but Christians during their colonial expansion, especially in South America, but also in Africa and other places, behaved terribly. But I don't think it was certainly not in the 19th century. It wasn't so much in the name of Christianity as because they were doing things on behalf of imperial expansion.
Just a brief comment, if you don't mind. Dr. Answer to your question, if I may. Although yesterday, and now I might just basically, how shall I say, walk back what I said yesterday. Yeah, I spoke about anti-Semitism in the Bible and the post-biblical era. But truthfully, had not been because of the Christian church and the Christian indoctrination, anti-Semitism of today would not have been what it is. If it wasn't because of the Christian church, the Visigoth attacks against the Jews would not have taken place, Inquisition would not have taken place, the Holocaust would not have taken place, the Russian pogroms, the Ukrainian pogroms. The Nazi philosophy only found a fertile ground in Europe only because Christianity existed for almost 2,000 years before and was anti-Semitic. 1.5 million Jews were killed in the Ukraine, not by the Nazis, by the Ukrainian Catholics. And so yes, unfortunately, it is Christianity that has brought anti-Semitism of today, the way we see it. Yes, it has morphed and mutated, but without the Christian church and Christian doctrine against Jews, we would not have the anti-Semitism that we have today.
Yeah, no, can I say something about it?
Yeah, let me just say one thing quickly. Just to follow through, I think also in terms of anti-Semitism, Bassam Tibi, I agree with his assessment. He looks at anti-Semitism as a European Christian-rooted phenomenon, inherently genocidal, and he spoke about discrimination against Jews in Muslim societies, which was terrible. There were pogroms and killings, and Jews had to be second-class citizens, and they couldn't be as equal, they couldn't be equal as a Muslim, etc. And that's the problem of Israel, by the way, because Israel is the only country in the Islamic world of quotations that has self-determination, where a Jew, a Christian, and a Muslim will be equal under the law. And it's not a question of territory in the occupied territories. Tel Aviv was the only city-state of Israel, and all the other land was not a part of Israel. If a Jew and a Muslim and a Christian and a woman and a man and a gay and straight person were equal in Tel Aviv, this would be a problem for the Muslim Brotherhood and the Islamist ideology, because a Jew cannot be equal to a Muslim. This is the practice. And I think in terms of colonialism and racism and the church, and it's not my area of expertise, but I did look at the role of the church in the Canadian context and in parts of Africa. And yeah, the church played an important role in South America, the Spanish, the Portuguese, the Dutch, the British. The church was an integral part of the colonial expansion project and played a crucial role. And I'll just say that we were talking, I was in Ghana at one of the forts that was for slave trade. The slaves were sent to the Americas. And one of the most staggering things to me, it boggled my mind, you had these dungeons where the slaves were living in squalor and in profound, horrible conditions where they were basically dying. And the ones that survived that were put onto ships. So the people were suffering, and there were these wood beams on a ceiling that's lower than this ceiling, and there was a church on top of the dungeons. So people were praying to their God, above this, and so the church was there, and the story that you've told, I know a little bit about it. It's sort of been repeated in various forms in different parts of the world, as I'm sure you know.
All right, and further to what Professor Kubik said, that there was not much anti-Semitism in China and India and the Far East, is because Christianity was not there for 2,000 years. And that's why there is no such deep-rooted, really, anti-Semitism.
It's not only anti-Semitism, it's a rejection of the other, of the Tutsis and the Iroquois and the Innu, and wherever they went, the other was not, was not perceived as human. And some people were fortunate enough to be able to convert. There's situations we know in colonial history where the church decided that these people were not worthy of conversion and had to be eliminated. So in a tragic way, your grandparents were lucky. And any other comments and questions? Oh, wait, Harry, you already
Sorry.
Anybody hasn't spoken? Aaron. And if anybody else wants to speak, just signal to me and I'll write your name down.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Morris. You had said that Zionism, according to, and it's not a direct quote, but Zionism, according to Islamic scholars, effectively ruled out the demi-status Jews and therefore was heretical. So, question is kind of like Harry's question. Do you think the existence of Zionism today is seen as a humiliation of dhimmi status, and if so, how does that play into radical forms of jihad? The issue of, you know, the Jews being replaced with Islam and coming back under dhimmi status, particularly in Israel.
Well, the problem isn't Zionism. The problem is the existence of the State of Israel, in which Jews are a sovereign and rule over, not only sovereign and rule over themselves, but also rule over a minority of Arabs, which many Arabs find humiliating. And you can connect it to the fact that this is like completely contradictory to the whole idea of the people of the book being dhimmis, being second class or subordinate peoples. It's a standing humiliation for many Arabs and believers, Muslim believers, who think that the right way is that Muslims should rule over other peoples in the Islamic lands.
One could argue that the largest group of Jewish people in Israel are Arab. But anyways, it's another story.
I guess it's a method, whatever. It's a method question. Thank you.
Methodology.
Yeah. I think rightfully so. So, like, for example, the duty status kind of stuff, right? So we can like point to that in this kind of intrinsic hierarchy that's within at least that perspective of, or that interpretation of Islam or whatever.
This is not an interpretation of Islam. This is this is how Islam ruled for 1400 years until the end of the Ottoman Empire. Essentially, they ruled over the peoples who were Christian or Jews and saw them as subordinate, as necessarily ultimately subordinate. They could not be equals in Islamic state.
I can see that. That's true. That's true. So we could, I'm a biblical scholar, so like we could go Zechariah 14, there's a lot of rhetoric within like in Tanakh about like the subjugation of Gentiles and how that is like ushering in the kingdom. Would that be considered xenophobic or Islamophobic or no?
You're talking about in the Bible how the Jews at the time, or the Hebrews at the time, related to the peoples they had conquered or wanted to conquer. Yeah, this is a template, if you like, and a lot of Germans scholars pointed to it as a template for the subjugations of peoples, and they can refer back to the Bible that this is how it was. But we're talking about something which was true 2,500 years ago. That is what happened in the Bible, what the stories relate in the Bible, how the Jews treated the Gibeonites and the Amalek and so on. This is something which is 2,500 years ago, and Judaism, I think, has moved on from there.
Okay.
Dr. Morris, I'm curious, how was your thesis about 48 as a jihad been received by your fellow historians? There's another religion an issue, after all, in this, which is anti-Zionism, the anti-Zionist religion, which sees 48 as a catastrophe for the Palestinians. How are your fellow historians looking on your thesis?
Well, I would say basically they are against. My fellow historians, most historians, most historians don't like. I mean, historiography is supposed to be a process of innovation, but most historians don't like people contradicting their beliefs, which is a type of innovation. And the idea that which I presented in my book in 1948, that the war was in large measure on the Arab side, motivated by religious fervor, religious passions, religious beliefs, they didn't like that. They thought the convention had been that the war was from the Arab side waged as a national political struggle over a piece of land, and that's it. So new ideas are quite often denied or rejected until they eventually take over.
Inshallah.
So I'd like to bring it back a little bit to some of the other questions that have been raised. I'm still not quite sure how to phrase what I mean here, so bear with me for a moment. But and I don't mean this as a criticism of anyone in the room. I'm just trying to clarify a little bit. Are we, to bring it back even further, to maybe subscribing to a little bit of Orientalism by conceiving of Islam as sort of stagnant? We are using ancient hadiths and passages and using the standard of the Dhimmi, which is something that not just ended with the end of the Ottoman Empire, but the Ottoman Empire ended it prior to their fall. We're using these things that are not really relevant to modern Islam. And to quote what you said about modern Christianity, just say that the mainstream is not teaching these things. As we heard a moment ago, the mainstream is advocating for completely different things. So
The mainstream where?
sorry, of mainstream Islam.
Where?
Well, I mean, we just heard a moment ago that most of the largest sects of Islam today are not advocating for these things. These are specific sects of Islam, just as there are specific sects of Christianity that still
Quite
advocate
large
for these
sects.
sort of thing.
The minority is quite a large minority.
Yeah. Well, now we have quite a large minority of Christianity that does the same thing in America, which is, to advocate for violent upheaval. Christian nationalism has taken quite a large chunk out of it. And I'm just wondering, what is, is this a little Orientalist? What is the difference between conceiving of Islam like this and conceiving of other religions like this?
This is a very general, this really is a very general question. I'm not an expert on the streams of and the currents of thought in modern Christianity. I have a sense that Christianity essentially has moved on from its crusading and enslaving mentality and practices. That I think has changed. You're right that there's a resurgence of evangelical Christianity in America, and in some ways some of it is violent, etc. But I don't think we're actually talking about Twin Towers type of violence. It's not the same, as far as I can see. I'm not an expert on this. I think the problem that there is an ongoing struggle, as I see it, inside Islam between moderates and extremists. I haven't yet seen that the moderates are winning or in this struggle. I don't know if they're winning in the struggle. I don't know. I don't. This may be what did you call it?
Moderates are losing.
What?
The moderates are losing.
Yeah, that's what it feels like.
The moderates are losing.
That's what it feels like, and this is extremely unfortunate for humanity as well as for the Muslims themselves. The point about Christianity, which the rabbi made, I can't remember, is probably true. You were talking about anti-Semitism. I was talking about other things, not anti-Semitism. But in terms of anti-Semitism, the foundations of modern anti-Semitism in part lie with Christian doctrine and Christian even practice, at least in its first centuries. As you say, it even informed Nazi anti-Semitism in some way. But one shouldn't also forget Bonhoeffer and other Christians who paid with their lives, etc., priests and Catholics as well, who opposed Hitler in various ways. And that they today are said to represent what real Christianity was in the Third Reich.
But they didn't do it for Jewish interests, they did it for Christian theological.
Okay, that too, but there were some, I think, who sympathized with the Jews as well. But you're right, most of it was probably because they thought he was bad for Christianity. Yes. Yes.
I think if I may respond to what Ben said, Ben, this is a seminar on anti-Semitism, and I know Harris agrees with me, and I think I agree with what Harris said as a footnote to the debate between Benny and Harris. I agree with what he said, but I know that Harris is also, and I are very engaged in the impact of anti-Semitism, not only in scholarly discourse, but in reality, in communities and in the region. And I would urge you to kind of back away from the sort of postmodern, politically correct, woke notion that by looking at anti-Semitism in the region and in communities is somehow Orientalist. This is a real issue. This is a real danger. This is poisoning
I agree.
Islam. This is
It is
poisoning
poisoning
communities, and we should not, I think, in the name of wokeness, as Harris struggles all the time for, is it sort of the low expectations of
Bigotry of low
the bigotry of low expectations, and we shouldn't dismiss this horrific reactionary social movement wherever it exists. If it's Christian, Muslim, Jewish, whatever, there's a movement that we need to understand and be aware of. And it reminds me, this discourse reminds me, I did sort of take it away from Muslim, Christian, Jewish, anti-Semitism. I did a study in Quebec on youth unemployment in the African Canadian and Jewish Canadian communities of Montreal. And you know, Montreal is English and French, and there's a French nationalist movement, and minorities are kind of marginalized. And we did a study on youth unemployment, and in the African Canadian youth community, the youth, there was 80% unemployment, and in the Jewish community there was like 65% unemployment, and in the Quebec national average was about 14 or 15%. So I went to the University of Montreal where I did a postdoc, which is a French nationalist university, and I presented the findings. And what did the intellectuals at the University of Montreal said? Okay, what is the black community? What's the Jewish community? There's English and French, there's men and women, there's Sephardic Jews and Ashkenazi Jews and Mizrahi Jews, and there's blacks from the Caribbean and blacks that are indigenous to Canada and African immigrants. So there's no Jewish community, there's no black community, therefore there's not a problem with immigrants. Even though we're fourth, fifth, sixth generation Quebecois, they still refer to us as immigrants, and it's not a problem. They deconstructed away the community. So we have to be careful. That's,
I just wanted to add one thing. You mentioned about the Ottoman moving away from the whole idea of dhimmi status and dhimmitude even before the fall of the Ottoman Empire. This is completely incorrect, of course. They did issue statutes which on the books supposedly gave Christians and Jews as well equal rights to, equal status to Muslims, but essentially they also killed all the Christians during the following decades. So they didn't really think of Christians as proper, full human beings with equal status to Muslims. They just tried to kill them, that's all, and expel them. You can't forget that.
Just a quick thing to add to what Charles was saying, like in response to Ben. Like in reality, also if you look at like what children are being taught at schools in like the Palestinian curriculum and that, you know, they're being, you know, quite a lot of it is anti-Semitic. So so you've just got to look at like reality on the ground. It's not something that's like a obviously it's a minority in the bigger scale of things, but like in reality this tough thing actually is taking place. So yeah.
all right. So on behalf of everybody, Benny, really thank you for being here.
My pleasure.
And thank you for the vibrant discourse and discussion and debate. But I also want to thank you on behalf of many scholars who are dealing with anti-Semitism for looking at Islam, political Islamism, jihad in the discourse and changing, hopefully, this sort of politically correct, anti-Orientalist view of scholarship that we've been indoctrinated in, and sort of shaking the foundations of these worldviews. Very important. So thank you.
Thank you.
We have one announcement. My colleague Chloe would like to make an announcement.
Hi, so over the last few days and increasingly so over the upcoming conference, we've heard a lot about certain thinkers and left-wing academia and schools of thought. For example, we've heard the names Edward Said, Adorno, Sartre, Judith Butler. We've heard of theories like Orientalism. We've heard quotes such as, "I am the only true follower of Adorno, I am the last Jewish intellectual, and if the Jew did not exist, then the anti-Semite would create him." For some people here, that they may be very familiar with these thinkers and concepts, but for some others, this might be your first time encountering them. And so I think it's important that as many people can join in the critical conversation